All right, that's just okay. That is just to accentuate what I was saying about diseases in the ancient world. That is an ancient hair comb that somebody, they had combs in those days, believe it or not, that somebody got from Jericho, and on close examination it was found to be full of lice eggs. And they found bricks at Jericho which are full of bacteria, and so obviously our modern understanding that there are such things as germs and germs cause disease, that was just, they didn't get that, they didn't understand that, and there was a lot of suffering as a result. Right, that is a cutaway of a fairly typical Israelite house. Now, the first thing on entering the Jewish house would have been the most important room in the house, which was actually the courtyard. And that's that bit there, if you can see the red pointer. And there's the front door there at the bottom of the picture. You walk in the front door, and that's what you would have seen. The courtyard was pretty much the center of the Jewish house. Many varied activities took place in the courtyard. By the first century, the idea of the Jewish house had pretty much been influenced by the Roman ideas of houses. The Romans had two types of house. They had the domus, which was for the posh aristocracy. Then you had the insula, and the insula was like a block of flats, 7, 8, 10 stories high or so. And in the middle of the insula would be a courtyard, a general communal courtyard, where all the families would meet together and congregate. And in a very broad sense, the Jews of Israel seems to have been influenced by this in the first century. And just looking around there, you've got your courtyard there with your rooms going around on either side, your various rooms, with the communal courtyard in the middle. And I'll go through details one by one. Various things that you might have seen as you looked at the courtyard. You might have seen Mary and her daughters. They would have done the cooking there. To one side of the courtyard, there might have been a small mud brick oven that would have been for doing the cooking. You might see a spinning loom. Mary and her daughters would have done would have made all their clothes, made Jesus' clothes, Joseph's clothes on a spinning loom. You might even see chickens in a coop to one side, and indeed Jesus and his brothers and sisters playing in the courtyard. You would probably have seen a cistern in the courtyard. That hole there is probably the cistern. The cistern could be anything from 2 meters. In a typical house might be 2 or 3 meters. It's just a container for water, for containing the household water. If they ran out of that, of course, they could go down to one of the wells in the village. The cistern would be accessible by a hole roughly the size of a manhole. And my next title might surprise you. Board games. Right. As children in our day and age have games, so 2,000 years ago they had theirs. Some things seem to be pretty universal, pretty perennial. Zechariah 8:5 describes children playing in the streets of the New Jerusalem. At a place called Megiddo, which is 11 miles to the west of Nazareth, they found carved lines in the ground, which they reckon was a very early version of our modern hopscotch. Concerning board games, that is an ancient Egyptian game called Senet. Dates to around 3100 BC. Those who don't believe me, you can find these things in the British Museum. I'm not making it up. Senet seems to have been played roughly like our modern Ludo. That's the board there. Those are the counters. And the idea would be ultimately to get your counters around the board from one square to the other, and the first one to the end wins. So that's Senet, and the other one would be, it's called the Royal Game of That's quite an interesting one from an Old Testament perspective. That dates to about 2600 BC, and of course it's the hometown of Abraham, of the Chaldees. He lived 2000 BC, so who knows, maybe Abraham whiled his time away playing the Royal Game of Again, it seems to be a similar sort of idea to our Ludo. Get your counters around the board in some particular order. Right, as far as daily routine is concerned, what sort of typical daily routine would Jesus, Joseph, Mary, and his brothers and sisters have followed? We know that Jesus had younger brothers and sisters. Matthew chapter 13 tells us he had at least 4 brothers. It names the 4 brothers, and it mentions at least 2 sisters. So we know that there were at least 9 people in Joseph's family altogether. First of all, the hard-working peasant family would get up at daybreak, and it would be a day of extremely hard work. If we were to meet the ancient Israelites, the hands would be coarse, the skin would be dark. These people were people of the soil. They were used to hard work. They were used to hard graft. The first break of the day would come at 9 a.m., and that was a very strict prayer session. The Jews had at least 2 strict prayer sessions. The third hour, which is 9 in the morning, and the 9th hour, which is 3 in the afternoon. And they had a series of set prayers. I go through these in my book, the Shema, the 18 benedictions, and they recited these every day. A very common sight in Nazareth and throughout Israel would have been at 9 o'clock in the morning, Jesus, when he reached adulthood, Joseph and all the males of the village with their prayer shawls and their phylacteries. The phylactery was a strap they wore around their heads with a little box which contained verses of the Torah, and they'd be at it doing their set prayers. So 9 a.m. then the prayers. Then back to hard work. The first meal of the day would have been had in the late morning, 10, 11 o'clock, roughly corresponding with our brunch. And that would have been very basic by our standards, typical Mediterranean fare really. They would have had the flatbread would have been a staple of that, accompanied by olives, fruit or cheese. 12 o'clock was the siesta, very important. In the Mediterranean sun, it's extremely difficult to work, and so the 12 o'clock siesta would have been very important. It's a tradition that goes way back into the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 18, Abraham we read he's sleeping at the time when he's visited by the 3 mysterious visitors, the 3 mysterious heavenly visitors, and that takes place at 12 midday. Then back to work, punctuated only by 3 p.m. prayers. Then the second and last meal of the day would have been the late afternoon, well-deserved when they got back home after a hard day's work. We're accustomed to our 3 meals a day. I think that's a fairly recent development. I think breakfast was a result of the Industrial Revolution. But 2,000 years ago, certainly your peasants had 2 meals a day. Your Romans would have had 3 because they could afford it. And probably even your Herods and upper class people in Israel would have had 3 meals as well. The second meal of the day would have been slightly more exotic. You would have had your bread and fruit again, but accompanying this you might have had a delicious vegetable broth and not much else. So, hello? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Is Ant around? Is he? I don't know. Have I done something here? All right, I'll try to speak up. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So as you can tell, meat was a rarity. I haven't mentioned meat at all. And there's a very good reason for that. If you were a poor peasant and you had a sheep or a goat, you didn't just want to slaughter the thing and eat it. You wanted to hang on to it and use it for wool or milk or what have you. The most common meat they would have eaten would have been fish. And of course, when Jesus later in life went and settled in Capernaum, he would have had a great deal of fish, Capernaum being a fish town, and living with Simon Peter, a fisherman. Sorry. Right, we're going to go through 1 or 2 household items now. What one might have found in the house of Mary and Joseph, in fact. Sorry about that. Right. That's an example of ancient pottery in the ancient world. Now, just 1 or 2 words again, going to Israelite geography. There was a village quite close to Cyprus, which means it's also quite close to Nazareth, called Shechem. And Shechem was famous for making storage vessels. So if Mary or Joseph needed a storage vessel, they might have gone up to Shechem, a couple of miles away, and bought one from there. Alternatively, there was another famous village called Kephar Hanania, And there, Kefa Hanania was famous for its tableware, and it sold it not just in Israel, but outside the boundaries of Israel as well. So Kefa Hanania, that was right up north to the west of the Sea of Galilee, and right up at the top north, parallel with the north part. So if Joseph needed tableware, and presuming he couldn't make it himself, he might pop all the way up to Kefa Hanania for a fancy new bit of tableware. Now that, by contrast, is Roman-style pottery, and I'm not sure what that is. It might be used to contain fruit, I'm not too sure. But there's an important contrast that can be drawn with the Jewish-style pottery of the previous slide and this, and that is that it helps to accentuate the difference and the friction between Roman and Hebrew in the ancient world. As I said, Sepphoris and Nazareth, separated by 6 kilometers, there's a valley between them, and as archaeologists have moved slowly up toward Sepphoris, so they found more Roman-style pottery like that. But when they start in the valley and move toward Nazareth, they find more Hebrew-style pottery, which accentuates the idea that Nazareth, a very staunchly Hebrew, staunchly conservative village, very worried about Roman influence, and Sepphoris, by contrast, a very Roman city, very Roman-orientated city. Now, that is a limestone cup, and it's very important that it's made out of limestone. That, incidentally, is not the result of an archaeological dig. That's a modern reconstruction. But the Jews, because of their law, they were very picky about substances that would render them ritually unclean, what they could touch and what they couldn't touch. And limestone was one of the substances that they were allowed to use, that they were allowed to touch. And fortunately, limestone was prominent in Galilee, and so one found many limestone items. That's a typical cup, limestone mug of the era, and one would typically find that in the house of ancient Jewish people, maybe even Joseph himself. Right, now, a very exciting discovery, perhaps the most exciting one of this talk. In 2006, archaeologists were allowed for the first time to excavate properly a house that traditionally had been believed to be the house of Joseph and Mary in Nazareth. Surprisingly, very little archaeological research had been done in Nazareth up until then, but this is definitely the best find that they've made, and they found a lot of quite interesting things in it. This house, which could, and I stress, might be the house in which Jesus grew up. That's the main entrance. Now, the reason it looks a bit dark is probably because it's located underneath a convent. A nuns' convent had been built there, I think, in the 19th century, and the nuns actually got there before the archaeologists did. The nuns actually pulled out a number of interesting items, which we'll see just now. Anyway, as I say, that's the entrance to the house. That's the wall from the east side of the house. We don't know much about it at this stage. We know it had 2 rooms. The other interesting thing is that there's evidence of a staircase going up the one wall, which indicates that it probably had an upper room as well, as many of the houses did in that day and age. Now, as I said, the nuns got to the archaeological discoveries before the archaeologists did. They did a lot of digging around, and they actually came up with the following 3 items found in the house. That's a rather lovely Roman glass vase, which completely opposes everything I was saying about Nazareth being a Hebrew town. But anyway, that's a Roman-style glass vase, which may or may not have been in the house of Mary and Joseph. That's a rather lovely shard from a perfume bottle. They possibly would have bought it at one of the markets, in one of the fancy markets in Sepphoris. And that, interesting enough, is the wall from a spindle. Now, as I said, every house would have had spindles. Mary would have made all the clothes for the family. It would have been very common to see Mary at her loom, and that is a wall which I'm told is a very important part of a spindle. The spindle can't work without a wall. So who knows, that could, and I must stress again, might be from the spindle that Mary herself used. Right, the last section, I don't have time to go through everything I'd like to go through, understandably, But the last sector I'd like to deal with is medicine and doctors in the ancient world, because it's quite a fun thing to deal with. It comes a little surprise to learn that medicine in the ancient world was in a fairly dire state, at least compared with